And starting the next Q&A session, I again wanted to thank everyone for the questions and actually emphasize that it's turned out that we have far more questions than we will even get through in this session. So of course we'll roll more of these questions into the next session. We actually have so many it's become difficult to actually categorize them on the fly into organized groups. So unfortunately this will be a little bit more free form and potentially skipping from topic to topic. I did want to try to address a number of questions that have sort of informed consent themes. Someone asked if you need IRB oversight when you're using the MyStudies app, and I think in general, as envisioned, we figured that in most cases there would be IRB oversight. At times, there may be IRBs that waive informed consent for due to specific characteristics of the study. This sort of dovetails with some other questions we had about, could this tool be used outside of clinical research? Could this be used in some type of healthcare quality improvement type studies? And there might be other, or even consumer type studies, and there might be other situations where IRB oversight might not apply. And I think our view is if the open source technology works and you see a use case and you can leverage it, why not help those activities as well? We did have a question about essentially if let's say you were running a clinical trial and you wanted to use the mobile app for, say, the majority of your patients, but you had a minority of patients who preferred to use a paper-based system, how could you combine their data? And there certainly on the very back end, you could download the data from the storage environment and combine it sort of on the back end where someone else would have already done the data entry from the paper-based process. But it would also potentially be possible to, and obviously you would need to set up the whole situation to show so it made sense and the protocol was very clear how this was done. But you could have a situation where, a trial staff member obviously utilizes the app to enter the information from the paper-based process from the patient, and it could be incorporated sort of at the front end that way. And somewhat related was someone else had a use case where they were saying potentially I might have a situation where I have research subjects and I'm using other methods to collect their information, so there's no need for the patients themselves to provide data through the app, but we'd like to configure the app to allow researchers to collect data at the bedside. And I think that goes back to one of my earlier discussions about how there could be, outcomes reported by healthcare workers, and yes, you could configure the app in that way, and the research staff member could become the reporter for the app instead of the patient. We had sort of a question about our practical experience with our first IRB in our sort of demonstration observational study that was carried out with, what I'll just mention is it was carried out with Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute. And there was a question about if you update or add a notification, sort of did you submit every notification change to the IRB? And in general, I think that the IRB review tended to be slightly more, a little bit higher level than that. They typically wanted to understand, like the IRBs that we're encountering, they want to understand how you're communicating with the patients. They want to understand the contents of all of the questionnaires that are provided. They wanted to understand basics of how notifications might work, but they, it tended not to get into an issue of, did you potentially make like a slight change to the timing of a notification or something like that. There was another question about divergence among IRBs by site, and certainly if you're following sort of broader sort of U.S. government policy, there have been changes to the common rule, and central IRBs are certainly recommended now. So obviously, in conjunction with that policy recommendation, I would certainly recommend, when possible, using central IRBs when you have multi-site studies, and that makes things easier for the app and for the study as a whole. If in some situation where you might need to set up different sort of custom interactions by site, that's actually why this whole system was developed, to be a system that could be partitioned to support multi-site studies. So effectively what you would do is, you would have one clinical trial, but your study configuration, quote unquote, in the web configuration portal would actually be separate for, say, if there were 3 sites and they all had slightly different configurations that you needed, you would actually basically have 3 different iterations, 3 different studies in the WCP that are all supporting the one clinical trial, but enable you to have, some of those custom features by site. We did have a question about notifications being sent to a select group of people in a study, and that is on our roadmap for improvements. Right now, you would have to send separate questionnaires to those groups. Received more of a policy question, which is, now that FDA has created a product to submit mobile data collection for clinical studies, will improved guidance be available on how to make digital health tools such as these FDA compliant? And I would refer you to our former SBIA webinar on the real-world evidence framework, which we released in December 2018. In that webinar, which you're welcome to watch, it's recorded, and it's shorter than this. All of the guidance work streams that are contemplated under the 21st Century Cures Act and are actually outlined in the FDA framework for the Real-World Evidence Program. And yes, one of those guidance work streams is actually focused on digital health technology tools to include mobile devices, wearables, etc. So stay tuned. The deadline for our guidance to be public in draft form is New Year's Eve 2021. Okay, let's see. This is another question related actually to sort of the user point of view, and it says, if a new user downloads the app, will we see all studies in the app, including all companies that might be using the tool? And I understand where that question might have come from, because in Zach's demo, there was sort of a whole number of studies that were being configured, but this was all being handled by one program at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. But again, number one, I'd just like to make a couple things clear again about the data, about how all this works. So number one, I'd just like to repeat, the FDA will not see your data, because you will take the code, you will create a storage environment, and you will operate, publish the app yourself, and you'll operate it on your behalf as an organization. And so you would not have access to another organization's data. The FDA would not have direct access to your data as you're collecting it. And also, the public would not have access to your data. Sorry, I'm just trying to wrap a number of concepts into one response. Maybe it makes sense to kind of reframe this and say, let's say you are a single medical center. like the Martin Clinic. So it would be like the Martin Clinic app, and the Martin Clinic app might have, 4 or 5 different clinical trials all in one therapeutic area, and so the patient might have that app have a specific condition that fits into that therapeutic area, and they might go in and use authentication tokens that you've provided to authenticate, or they might be able to, for instance, answer some eligibility questions and then know to contact you and then get an authentication token and then come in. So there's a way to sort of maintain contact with the patients who are working with you, and so that's sort of that gateway app capability, and that's a means to potentially engage them in more than one study if appropriate. But again, there's no aspect of, just because this is open source, that does not mean that people will be seeing other people's studies. This is directly intended to be useful and partitionable and to fit into sort of the current clinical research world. I was asked if the agency could recommend an FDA-compliant open source data management platform, and going back to my original disclaimer at the start of this webinar, the agency cannot recommend any specific commercial products or services to include an FDA-compliant open source data management platform. I was also asked essentially if code is used and code is altered from the open source GitHub, does it lose, in a sense, its 21 CFR Part 11 certification? And I wanted to just mention again, you can read the FDA guidance. Please refer to it. The FDA does not actually provide certification for 21 CFR Part 11 purposes to any commercial product, and so this also is not specifically certified, since there is no FDA process for that. I think the spirit of the question is essentially you attempted to implement this, you implemented it in a compliant manner following all of this guidance, and so if we're making changes, then obviously we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to think about how those changes might impact compliance, and I think that's certainly true, and so you need to be thinking about design issues, software issues, as well as other procedural and sort of policy issues. Okay, also had some questions about like use cases. So, there were a couple of questions suggesting that this could be used for screening study subjects who should have a further evaluation at a study visit. And I think we've sort of touched on this. So in our first pilot study, I think there's 2 ways that sort of screening could take place. There's what I was just describing with the gateway app function, that you sort of have a population of patients that you've been working with. Maybe you deal with them clinically. Maybe there's also clinical research going on. They've participated in a trial before, and through that gateway app functionality, they could potentially see other studies that your group is sponsoring, and they would pop up, and they could answer some eligibility questions, and then that could prompt them to come to your clinic, for a more thorough screening. But there's also the model that we essentially already modeled in the first observational study, where we used claims and electronic health record data to basically look for people who, from the standpoint of the operational algorithms that we had defined for our inclusion and exclusion criteria in those real-world data sources, once we found the people who met those characteristics, we reached out to them with authentication tokens and asked them to enroll. So that was modeled, and you could sort of do a similar thing where you could say, you reach out to them and you still bring them back for further screening, but, based on the EHR data or based on the claims data, you appear to be someone who might qualify for such and such trial, please come in. So that certainly, is a type of use case that could be envisioned. There were some questions about data elements, and other speakers may have things to say about this to add to what I'm saying. But So, I mean, you have these questions, obviously, that are configured in WCP, and then, you get the schema automatically created. And so, that functionality basically allows you to have potentially structured responses or potentially unstructured free text responses. And we've always thought it was important to have both capabilities. So you might have some needs for qualitative or unstructured responses. At the same time, you might want someone to have a drop-down list or a drop-down menu and be selecting from standardized things like ICD codes or RX norm codes. So, so that is certainly possible. And so I think that, what we've attempted to do is to say when you're trying to develop drugs, which is not an easy job, you need to think about your clinical and regulatory goals, and then you need to think about the information needs that support those goals, support those endpoints, and then basically this platform is flexible so that you can operationalize the way you ask things in different ways. And again, there are some question types that are part of ResearchKit and ResearchStack that we include in our online resources just to say, look, these are still part of the app because the app came from these frameworks, even though some of these questions are unlikely to be used in clinical research, or in some cases may not really be questions you would want to ask in clinical research, but they're part of the functionality of ResearchKit and ResearchStack, and we didn't eliminate them precisely because we had people talk about some of those other uses like quality improvement or consumer things, and so we didn't want to strip away functionality. At the same time, there may be some type of validated outcomes instrument that isn't adequately supported by the functionality that we have created, which is enhanced and over and above what ResearchKit and ResearchStack originally had, but occasionally may be difficult. So I can mention from some practical experience, we were trying to implement one PRO at one point, and we had limited the amount of characters that were sort of available in a response because we were thinking about the mobile screen size and making sure that people could, read everything appropriately, and we had to do a little bit of sort of custom development work to change things to accommodate that. So I think that those will be some considerations for you. I had a couple questions about, are you required to use LabKey resources? And yes, this whole system is open source. You can disaggregate almost any part of the system. So if you have some other environment that you want to use, you can use that. And I think the same things we talked about changing code remaining compliant would apply. I have a ton of extra questions here. I'm not going to get through them all. Why don't I take a break, save some of mine for the next section, and I'll let some other people answer questions and keep going.
Thanks, David. This is Zach, and I'm going to answer a few questions. First, we saw a few questions related to the GitHub repository, so I'll try and address sort of all of those together. The GitHub repository now has 3 branches on it. A new branch, new version of the open source code is available as of today. So as we have been developing and supporting this system across Harvard Pilgrim, FDA, LabKey, and BTC, we've seen a lot of questions come in, and it's great to have that kind of support and feedback. So we will continue to be looking and answering as many questions as possible, and we think that the new code release addresses a lot of the questions that have come up since the original release in November. A question that has come up a lot, especially in these questions from this webinar, is about a license. So there's now a top-level license text, top-level license file that hopefully addresses the question about whether or not there's a license that states this is truly an open source piece of software. Related to that, the LabKey server is based on the Apache 2.0 open source license, and that is, of course, open source. We got a few questions related to informed consent, mostly about how can you ensure that a participant in a study within the mobile app has the opportunity to ask questions to a study administrator, researcher, or physician before actually enrolling in the study within the app. So there's a variety of ways that this could be done. While the app itself doesn't have a mechanism to officially stop somebody from enrolling outside of the enrollment token that has to be issued to that person, you could set up your enrollment and recruitment process so that a participant doesn't get an enrollment token until potentially they've already talked with a physician or already gone through a process that ensures they understand what's written in the consent form. You can also, of course, and we have done this in the pilot project, the pilot study, put contact information within the consent form and give people or let people know that they have the opportunity to call study administrators if they have any questions. And the third option, as organizations brand this and create their own version, you can put an anonymous feedback email address and a non-anonymous email feedback email address in the app that allows users of the app to send an email either anonymously or by identifying themselves to a designated inbox so they can get questions answered before they decide to enroll in any study that exists within a particular branded version of the app. Okay. A few questions came in related to questionnaire functionality, and I'll address a few of those. One is about data quality and if there are any checks and that sort of thing. So there are no specific post-response data quality checks. That sort of thing we would recommend is done sort of by data analysts via whatever processes they might currently use. However, the system does include a large number of validations on the front end configurable within the WCP to ensure that only the correct data types, formats, and values are entered in a response. So as you saw, you can restrict questions to numeric types, text choice types, drop-down or value picker type, and then beyond that, you can restrict a response option to only certain values or certain characters. So there's a lot of ways to validate data and ensure that only the data you're looking for are captured by a particular question. One final question, actually two final questions I'll address. One, what kind of issues came up in the pilot study? So I would say the main thing that came up was the concept of a dashboard and patient engagement in general. So there's always different ways, some more effective than others, to get a patient to continue to engage with the study, whether it's digital, paper, phone, or some other method. So we tried working with a lot of experts and clinicians to make the most generalizable dashboard and patient engagement experience as possible. And as this platform is continued to be supported, and we work with more and more groups, we get better and better feedback about patient engagement and how to improve the dashboard and make it, and have it provide good feedback to patients who are participating in the study. The final question I'll address is, can this app be validated in the App Store, or is it a guarantee that an app would be approved in the App Store, I should say, after it's rebranded with a particular organization's branding? And there's never a guarantee that Apple or Google will approve an app, but because it's based on existing frameworks, the Research Kit and Research Stack framework, it's a very high likelihood that a rebranded version of this app would be approved. Apple very strongly enforces that an app maintain its own organization's branding when published from that organization's app store. So as long as that rule is followed and it uses existing Apple-provided frameworks and developer tools, then there's a very, very high likelihood of it being approved. And that's it for me. We have about a minute left, and now Adam Rauch is going to answer a few questions.
All right, so since I have 1 minute, I'm going to answer a few questions that are going to lead straight into Stuart's presentation. So we had a few questions related to hosting and security. How and who is hosting the data? So the answer there is you host the data. You're hosting the system, and you can do that however you want. And Stuart will give you some of the details, at least about his recommendations and best practices that we followed deploying the system ourselves. Where is the data stored? Is it possible to store data on servers in Europe? Again, it's up to you, and certainly you could deploy this system on servers that are in Europe or anywhere else in the world. And perhaps my favorite question of the day, can any hacker, other government agency, be able to access data stored in the app? And so the answer there, as you heard David say, the FDA will not have access to your data. Other government agencies will not have access to your data. Ideally, hackers will not have access to your data either. But this is, again, up to you. And Stuart's best practices you may want to follow. Certainly the idea of FISMA and HIPAA, these are security frameworks that if you follow the best practices, if you follow these controls, you are much, much less susceptible to hacking. So with that, we will lead into Stuart.
And thank you so much, Adam.